I was at a dinner gathering just recently, and it really brought this whole thing into focus for me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was sitting across from this woman who was just effortlessly charming, the type, dominating the conversation, cracking jokes, just for 2 hours, the most socially capable person there.
Right. Got it.
But then a tiny friction point occurred. Someone just asked her, very politely, why she hadn't replied to a group text. It was time sensitive, about the reservation.
Okay, a simple question.
A simple question. And the transformation was, it was instantaneous. The charisma just vanished, replaced by this look of sheer, wounded hostility.
Wow.
She didn't apologize. She didn't even give a normal excuse, oh, I was busy. Instead, she leans in and her voice is trembling with this righteous indignation.
And she says,
I struggle with object permanence and overwhelm. Demanding a response is actually incredibly ableist. You're invalidating my neurodivergence. The whole table just froze. It was a breathtaking maneuver, really. In 5 seconds, she turned her own rudeness into a moral failing of the person she'd ignored.
That's a tactic.
It's a tactic. And that rapid switch, from this highly functional socialite to a fragile victim, the second accountability shows up. It just perfectly encapsulated this strange trend we're seeing. The use of these psychiatric labels, not for understanding, but as a get-out-of-jail-free card for being frankly unbearable. That moment for me just defined what's happening. We're watching this really sophisticated language from therapy, from advocacy, from clinical diagnosis being co-opted. It's being weaponized.
Shut down conversation.
Just shut down basic human friction, to avoid any consequences for bad behavior. It turns a personal inconvenience into systemic oppression. And that's what this deep dive is about. We want to unpack that shift. Our mission is really to analyze how this widespread online self-diagnosis of, ADHD, narcissistic traits, how it's fundamentally reshaping our social interactions, how it's creating a culture where shifting blame is just easier than taking responsibility.
And what you're describing, what we see playing out online every single day is this inevitable collision. You've got this unprecedented amount of information on one side.
Right.
And on the other, a pretty profound cultural crisis of personal accountability. The sheer ease of access to all this mental health content it's blurred the lines, the critical lines between genuine chronic symptoms and, ordinary human flaws.
Right.
Or just bad habits.
Yeah.
And this poses huge challenges, not just for how we deal with each other like at your dinner party, but critically to the very integrity of the mental health care system itself. When these really specific clinical labels are just thrown around as shields, we risk damaging their credibility for the people who actually genuinely need them.
Okay, so let's start at the source. The digital world. Specifically platforms like, TikTok, where mental health content, especially around ADHD, has just exploded. What does the data actually tell us about the quality of the information we're all consuming?
The scale of the misinformation is, it's genuinely staggering, and it's not like it's on the fringe, it's mainstream. Recent studies confirm just how widespread this stuff is. When researchers look specifically at claims about ADHD, which has become sort of a meme in some online spaces, they found that more than half of the claims circulating had, no scientific accuracy at all.
So you're saying it's a coin toss, you watch a video, and there's a 50% chance the symptom list you're seeing is just wrong, or way too general, or maybe even just made up for clicks.
That's exactly it. And this isn't, just one study. It mirrors earlier pretty rigorous research. There was a 2022 study that looked at the 100 most popular TikToks about ADHD. 50% of them were fundamentally misleading. So you have millions of people making these profound life decisions about their own, neurobiology based on information that would fail any basic clinical check.
And if that's the rate for something like ADHD, which is relatively well-defined, what happens when you zoom out to the whole mental health landscape online?
It gets much, much worse. When you look at general mental health content, the misinformation rate just skyrockets. Some studies suggest up to 80% of it could be misleading.
80%.
Yeah. And that's covering a huge range of things. OCD, autism, and even really complex misunderstood conditions like dissociative identity disorder. The biggest concern is just the sheer demographic reach. A massive percentage of young adults are basically learning about their own minds from sources that are statistically probably wrong.
And that volume of bad information, it has to lead to the second big problem, right? Which is this, pathologizing of the normal human experience. How do these videos usually frame symptoms?
They use a method of radical overgeneralization. They'll take these very common symptoms like feeling anxious or having a low mood or just struggling with, getting things done, symptoms that apply to a ton of different conditions.
Right. Could be anything.
Could be anything. And they present them as specific markers for one single trendy disorder like ADHD.
So if I'm feeling anxious and I see a TikTok that mentions difficulty focusing, I immediately think, oh, it's ADHD. And I completely miss the fact that it could just be, generalized anxiety or even just severe burnout.
Precisely. But what's even more damaging is how these videos deliberately pathologize things that are just part of being human. They'll take things that everyone does sometimes, procrastinating, not finishing a chore, getting really into a hobby for a weekend.
Sure.
And they label them as proof of some profound psychological dysfunction. You'll see a video that says something like, if you've ever listened to the same song on repeat, you have a neurodevelopmental disorder.
Which feels incredibly validating in the moment, I'm sure. But it's also completely inaccurate.
It creates this huge distortion in how we see things. Clinically, the best estimates we have say that ADHD prevalence in adults is around maybe 5 to 6%.
Okay.
But because of this trend, studies are showing that nearly 1 in 4 adults now suspect they have it. Young people are overestimating how common it is by these huge margins. It turns the normal frustration of being an adult into a diagnostic sign, when a real diagnosis requires that dysfunction to be chronic, pervasive, and severely debilitating across, multiple parts of your life.
And we have to talk about the money behind this. This isn't just accidental inaccuracy spreading around. A lot of this content is specifically designed for engagement and ultimately to sell you something.
Oh, that profit motive is absolutely central. The research showed that about half of the content creators they looked at were actively using this misinformation for direct financial gain.
Right.
They use their huge followings, their perceived authority to sell products or coaching services, and almost none of these people are actually licensed mental health professionals.
So what are they selling? What does that ecosystem look like?
It's a pretty broad market. You have physical products like branded fidget spinners or weighted blankets, special planners marketed as, neurodivergent friendly. But the coaching industry is where the real money is. It can be general life coaching or very specific ADHD coaching, and it's often from people whose only qualification is their own self-diagnosis and their ability to get a lot of views.
So the financial incentive is tied directly to making the viewer think they have the disorder. The creator convinces you that you have this problem, and suddenly you're a customer for their special solution. They profit by making the problem seem as widespread as possible.
It's a perfect self-reinforcing loop. The creator gets paid for convincing you your struggles are unique and pathological and that you need their guidance, which they are, of course, uniquely positioned to sell. And it creates an environment where the most generalized, fear-based clickbait content gets rewarded by the algorithm because that's what leads to sales.
Now, we have to be fair here and step back. People aren't just turning to TikTok because they're gullible. There's a real legitimate need that this online content is trying to fill, and it comes from failures in the system.
That is the essential piece of this. You're right. Historically, adult ADHD was massively underdiagnosed, especially in women.
Yeah.
The old models were all based on the hyperactive little boy.
Yeah.
Girls and women, though, they often internalize their symptoms. So they'd just be seen as, spacey or disorganized or forgetful, not disruptive.
So for them, these platforms were a revelation.
In a positive light, yes.
Yeah.
TikTok became this crucial first step. It let these overlooked adults, especially women, start to advocate for themselves and realize, hey, maybe my lifelong struggles actually have a neurological reason.
So you've got this mix of legitimate self-advocacy running straight into a wall of real-world healthcare failures, access issues, clinical bias, all of it.
Precisely. The appeal of self-diagnosis is completely rational when you look at the state of healthcare right now. First, there's just a general lack of trust in institutions, a feeling that the system won't listen or is too hard to access. And second, critically, there are severe documented shortages of licensed therapists and psychiatrists, especially ones who specialize in adult neurodevelopmental disorders. And this crisis is even worse for people who can't afford to pay thousands of dollars for a private evaluation. When real professional help is out of reach, the internet becomes the default. It's often the only source of information.
And there's research that explains why these platforms are so compelling, isn't there? It's because they satisfy these basic psychological needs that a dry clinical website just can't.
Yes, that's key. The idea of basic psychological needs, autonomy, relatedness, and competence explains it perfectly. Traditional medical info feels very top-down, right? A doctor tells you what's wrong. TikTok content, shared by someone you feel as a peer, gives you autonomy. You're finding the answers yourself. It gives you relatedness. You instantly find a huge community that says, me too. And it gives you competence. You feel smart because you've figured out your own problem. That whole relatable, community-driven package makes the information so much stickier and more satisfying than reading a WebMD page.
But the unfortunate bottom line, regardless of the good intentions or the systemic problems, is that most of these self-diagnoses are just wrong.
They are overwhelmingly inaccurate, especially when they're based only on this kind of generalized online content. When researchers analyzed it, they found that people are 5 to 11 times more likely to incorrectly diagnose themselves than to correctly identify a condition they actually have. That's a huge rate of false positives, and it leads to so many problems. Unnecessary anxiety, the wrong kind of treatment, and the very weaponization we started this whole deep dive with.
Okay, so let's shift from the number of diagnoses to the actual language being used, this rise of what people call therapy speak. It's this: incorrect or misused clinical language, borrowed from psychotherapy. And it has this formal, almost prescriptive tone that gives it this air of authority, even when it's being used to shut down a simple conversation.
Yeah, therapy speak is a lot like psychobabble, but it's more insidious, I think, because it often takes these very precise clinical ideas and just strips them of all their context and nuance.
And that wrecks communication.
It completely wrecks it, because the person using the term often has no idea what the real clinical weight of the word is. And critically, it's often used as a way to control the narrative, or, like we've been saying, just to get out of taking any responsibility.
Let's break down a few of the big ones, the terms that pop culture has just completely distorted. Let's start with trauma. Clinically, what is that actually supposed to mean?
So clinically, trauma is usually defined as the response to an event or a series of events that are horrific, violent, or life-threatening, things that fall way outside the normal range of human experience.
Like combat or a serious assault.
Exactly. Rape, combat, mass shootings, a major sudden loss. Pop culture, though, has just overused the term to mean anything bad. You know, feeling disappointed or inconvenienced, or just being upset after a disagreement.
And that must just trivialize the experience of people who have actual PTSD or complex trauma.
It does. It completely confuses trauma with stress or disappointment.
Yeah.
A bad thing happening in your life isn't automatically trauma. The clinical weight of the word, that psychological damage that just profoundly changes your ability to cope, it gets lost when you use it to describe, missing a flight.
Okay. Similarly, the word trigger, it used to mean something very specific, and now it's often just used to mean you upset me.
Right. A true clinical trigger is an otherwise harmless stimulus. It could be a smell, a sound, a texture.
Yeah.
That your mind is powerfully and involuntarily linked to a past horrific event.
So like a car backfiring for a combat veteran.
A perfect example. The sound of a car backfiring might trigger a full-blown panic response in a veteran who survived a bombing. The problem is that in therapy speak, it's used to mean, your opinion made me feel a negative emotion, which instantly makes the other person responsible for your feelings, even if all they did was express a mild disagreement.
And then we have gaslighting. That one had a huge moment a little while ago. Now it seems to be used for any kind of disagreement or even just a simple lie.
But the clinical meaning of gaslighting, which is a form of coercive control, is so much more specific and, frankly, devastating. It describes a calculated long-term pattern of psychological manipulation. It's usually done by someone very close to you, and it's specifically designed to make the victim doubt their own perception, their memory, ultimately their sanity. When someone lies about where they were last night, they're just lying. Calling that gaslighting conflates simple dishonesty with this systematic long-term abuse designed for total control.
It waters down the term for people who are actually experiencing it.
Completely. And finally, boundaries. We hear this one all the time, often as a justification for just cutting people off.
Right. I'm setting a boundary.
Exactly. But a true, healthy boundary is a considered choice about your own actions. It's meant to preserve relationships while protecting yourself. So you'd say, I can't discuss politics at dinner, and if you bring it up, I'm going to leave the room. It's a statement about what you will do.
But that's not how it's used.
Not in therapy speak. It gets turned into a tool to control other people. I need you to stop doing X, Y, and Z, or you're violating my boundaries. It becomes a demand that others have to obey, which often leads to blowing up relationships rather than its original goal, which was to make them healthier.
This misuse of language, it plugs into a much bigger idea, doesn't it? Something called the rhetoric of therapy.
Yes, and this is a concept that academics have been exploring. It's how political and cultural conversations adopt the language of therapy. Words like healing, coping, adaptation. But they apply it to social and political conflicts.
And how does that play out?
Well, this rhetoric is highly effective at maintaining the status quo. It encourages all of us to focus on our private lives, on self-help, on managing our own emotions. And that diverts all this crucial attention away from trying to fix flawed systemic power structures. The burden of fixing things shifts entirely onto the individual.
That sounds a lot like a modern version of the old self-made man myth. You know, if you fail, it's not the system's fault, it's a personal failing. You just didn't have enough grit.
It's the exact same logic. The self-made man myth was used to hide class and race inequality by saying it's all about individual effort. Today, the rhetoric of therapy does something similar. It persuades people who are struggling that it's their own individual fault. Maybe they just haven't healed enough or their boundaries are weak. It turns a systemic failure into a personal psychological project.
And the goal is to get people to conform.
The goal is subtle, but yeah, it's to exhort conformity and encourage these therapeutic values that are all about individualism and self-absorption.
So when you combine that historical context with this widespread, inaccurate use of clinical terms, that's when you get the conditions for that dinner party disaster, the weaponization of labels to dodge accountability.
That's the sociological friction point, exactly. You see these psychiatric labels used as a full stop, a moral get-out-of-jail-free card. We can see this really clearly in the story of the two developers, Liam and Sarah.
Right. This one captures the workplace conflict perfectly. So Liam, the junior developer, he uses his self-diagnosed time blindness to excuse everything. Missed deadlines, missed meetings, just general disorganization. And when his manager asks him to do something basic, like use a digital calendar, Liam calls the request ableist.
So Liam has taken the language of disability rights and turned it into a shield against any expectation of competence. He gets all the moral benefits of having a diagnosis, the lowered expectations, without doing any of the immense invisible work required to actually manage the symptoms.
Meanwhile, you have Sarah. She has an actual clinical diagnosis of ADHD, and she's performing this incredible self-management just to keep up. We're talking rigorous color-coded systems, expensive coaching, noise-canceling headphones, all just to get to a functional baseline.
So Liam, who's self-diagnosed, demands that everyone else adapt to him, while Sarah, who is clinically diagnosed, is doing all this exhausting self-adaptation to meet shared expectations. And you can see how the team's empathy just evaporates, because they see the label being used not as a reason for effort, but as an excuse for non-performance.
And that's the danger zone. This whole culture of self-diagnosed isms becomes this perfect hiding place for people who are emotionally immature and just refuse to do the hard work of taking responsibility.
It's been called vulnerable narcissism, cosplaying as neurology, which I think is a pretty sharp description. The label becomes the ultimate alibi. It turns the natural consequences of your actions into a form of persecution.
And the power of it is how it just shuts down any real conversation. The second that weaponized label comes out, you're being ableist. You're invalidating my neurodivergence. You are immediately in what can only be called an emotional hostage negotiation.
Exactly. The moment you push back, you become the villain. You're the oppressor, the one who lacks empathy. The accuser puts on the whole performance of victimhood, the trembling voice, the wounded look, until the person who is just asking for basic adult behavior backs down.
It's entitlement dressed up as vulnerability.
It is. It allows people to be avoidant, to have poor boundaries, even to be cruel, and to frame it all as someone else's fault for not accommodating them.
And the real tragedy in all this is that the genuine sufferers, the Sarahs of the world, they get dragged into this. The credibility of their real debilitating disorder gets compromised by the loudest, least accountable people in the room.
It creates a huge backlash. Society starts to infantilize or patronize people who are truly struggling, when all they really want are the tools to function on their own. The core message has to be that a diagnosis explains your brain's wiring. It explains why you struggle. But it does not excuse the negative impact you have on other people. Accountability is managing that impact, not expecting everyone else to be your emotional support staff.
This mechanism of pathologizing normal friction to create a simple villain is also big business online, especially in what some people call the narcissism industrial complex. The story of Maya and Tom is a perfect example of how influencers monetize this.
Right, so in the story of Maya and Tom, they're having a pretty standard, though painful, relationship problem. A big fight about money, and then Tom needing a few days of space to cool off and process the stress.
Happens all the time.
All the time. But Maya, feeling anxious and rejected, she goes online looking for answers, and she finds a very popular but unlicensed trauma coach on TikTok.
And what does this influencer tell her is happening?
The influencer immediately pathologizes this normal, solvable problem. Tom needing space is labeled stonewalling. His stress about finances is framed as financial abuse. So Maya, who is already primed to see herself as a victim, buys an online course on breaking free from narcissistic control. And just like that, a regular disagreement between two flawed people is elevated into this epic battle of good versus evil.
And the influencer profits because they feed that melodrama. The second you try to introduce any nuance like, maybe Maya's communication wasn't great, or maybe Tom just handles stress badly but isn't a clinical manipulator, the entire business model falls apart.
Exactly. The whole narcissism industrial complex runs on having clear villains and clear martyrs. It needs that hyperbole. If you reveal that the source material is just messy, ordinary dysfunction, the engagement plummets and the sales dry up. So they avoid the simple truth that most of what gets called narcissistic abuse is actually a complex tangle of disappointment, bad communication, and failed boundaries, not some orchestrated campaign by a master manipulator.
Because the myth of the perfect angelic victim being targeted by a psychological supervillain is just. It's more compelling and way more profitable than the messy reality of two adults just failing to communicate well.
And that myth is so attractive because it completely removes the need for self-reflection. If your partner's a clinical narcissist, then their behavior is fixed, and your own choices, why you stayed, why you reacted the way you did, why your boundaries weren't clear, none of that matters anymore. Pathologizing normal friction becomes this very elegant and very lucrative way to avoid the uncomfortable truth. That emotional maturity means you have to be willing to look at your own part in a conflict.
So this whole phenomenon isn't just staying on social media, it's spilling over and fundamentally disrupting the real world of clinical practice. We should talk about the crisis that's happening in the psychiatrist's office, using the example of Dr. Evans.
Dr. Evans' experience is, unfortunately, becoming completely routine. Clinicians aren't really facing patients who want an assessment anymore. They're facing patients who are demanding confirmation of an identity they've already built. These patients will come in with, like, a literal binder full of screenshots from social media infographics. And they're deeply invested in the belief that things like listening to the same song on repeat are the definitive proof of a specific disorder.
So they've spent 2 years in an online community, built an entire identity around this diagnosis, and they see the clinician's job as just stamping the paperwork.
That's it. The real tension starts when the clinician tries to do their actual job, which is called differential diagnosis, ruling out other possible causes for the symptoms. When Dr. Evans suggests that maybe the focus issues could be better explained by severe anxiety or burnout or even just too much screen time, the patient often sees that as an attack.
And they pull out the therapy speak we were just talking about?
Immediately. Any questioning of their self-diagnosis is instantly labeled medical gaslighting. They leave negative reviews online, threaten the practice, and the clinician is stuck in this profound ethical dilemma. How do you uphold rigorous medical standards when anything less than 100% affirmation is seen as a hostile act?
Which really highlights why those comprehensive evaluations are so important. They're the complete opposite of an online checklist. Can you talk a bit more about what a rigorous diagnosis actually involves?
A proper rigorous diagnosis for something like ADHD isn't just a 30-minute chat. It requires a comprehensive psychological evaluation that can take several hours and uses multiple tools.
Like what?
This includes long, structured clinical interviews, various self-report scales, cognitive testing, and most importantly, objective performance measures.
Objective measures, so things that try to get past just what the patient's telling you.
Exactly. A key tool is something called a continuous performance test, or CPT. This is a computer-based test that measures things like sustained attention and impulsivity. It'll ask you to respond to a target, say, press a button for every letter except the letter X for about 15 or 20 minutes.
And what does that show?
It gives objective data on your errors. Did you miss the targets? That's an omission error, a sign of inattention. Did you hit the button when you shouldn't have? That's a commission error, a sign of impulsivity. It helps the clinician see the difference between a patient feeling distractible and a patient having a fundamental neurobiological deficit in attention.
So that helps sort out effort from a neurological issue. But what about the complexity of the differential diagnosis itself? You mentioned anxiety and trauma can look like ADHD. How do clinicians work through that?
This is where the real skill of a clinician comes in. You have to figure out the why behind the symptom. Take the example of the teenager who self-diagnosed with ADHD. On the surface, her symptoms: couldn't sit still, racing thoughts, trouble finishing tasks. It looked exactly like classic ADHD.
Right.
But during her comprehensive evaluation, the testing revealed that the root cause wasn't a developmental attention deficit at all.
So what was it?
It was severe, unaddressed trauma that was causing anxiety and intrusive thoughts. The racing thoughts weren't disorganized attention. They were hypervigilance and trauma-based rumination that were physically stopping her from focusing on anything else.
Yeah.
The ADHD medication her parents got for her, it helped her stay awake, but it didn't touch the root cause. The right treatment was trauma-informed therapy, not stimulants.
That case is such a powerful illustration of why the first symptom, I can't focus, is only the very beginning of the story.
It's the difference between treating the symptom with a solution you found online versus rigorously finding the underlying cause. A good clinician has to check for everything: trauma, anxiety, depression, learning disorders that might better explain what's going on. That's how you avoid just rubber stamping an inaccurate self-diagnosis that started on TikTok.
We also need to acknowledge the psychological struggle of the person who's actually going through the diagnosis, filled with this confirmation bias. We saw this laid out on a Reddit thread.
That thread really captured what you could call the learner's fear. The user was so worried that because they had spent years researching the diagnostic criteria, they were subconsciously exaggerating their symptoms to fit the story. They were afraid their research was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, making them over-focus on the times they fit the checklist and ignore all the times they were fine. They were worried they were just normal, but were desperately looking for a neat package that explains all my problems.
And that fear of faking it has to be real, especially when the symptom lists are everywhere. So what does a clinician look for to cut through that potential bias?
Well, clinicians are trained to spot the difference between just matching media stereotypes and showing genuine chronic differences. We look for dysfunction in areas the patient hasn't thought to research, like poor working memory scores on cognitive tests, or poor objective time perception, which is a key feature of ADHD that's very hard to fake. And crucially, the diagnostic criteria require that the symptoms must have been present since childhood and must significantly and negatively impact your life across multiple settings: school, work, home. It's the severity and the pervasiveness of the impairment, not just having a relatable symptom now and then, that makes it a disorder.
So moving to the bigger picture here, let's talk about the sheer power of the label itself. This brings us to something called labeling theory.
Labeling theory is the framework for understanding the deeper consequences of all of this. It basically says that when you get a clinical diagnosis, it acts as this powerful cultural label. It puts you in a category: neurodivergent, mentally ill, whatever it is.
And that category comes with baggage.
It comes with potent cultural stereotypes, both good and bad. And when a person internalizes that label, the stereotypes become part of their self-concept, which can create negative feelings and potentially lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy.
The idea that just giving someone a role can change their behavior. It's backed up by some pretty chilling experiments, like the Stanford prison experiment.
The Stanford prison experiment is it's an ethically complicated but dramatic example of the power of a label. Participants who were randomly assigned the label of guard or inmate internalized those roles so fast and so deeply that their personalities changed. The guards became authoritarian and cruel, and the prisoners became helpless and pathological. They had to shut the whole experiment down after just 6 days because of the psychological damage. It just shows how quickly a label can transform your sense of self and how you treat others.
So when we're talking about this crisis of overdiagnosis and self-diagnosis, we're not just talking about getting the wrong medication. We're talking about the danger of putting an unnecessary, culturally loaded label on someone. According to this theory, that label can have these deep, harmful consequences, whether the person even realizes it or not.
Exactly. Both overdiagnosis and self-diagnosis involve putting someone in a category that carries a real cultural stigma stereotypes about your competence, your reliability, your safety. If you're incorrectly labeled, you risk internalizing those negative stereotypes. You might start to believe you're fundamentally incapable of being organized, so you stop trying, which then creates more problems. It's a classic self-fulfilling prophecy.
And the really tricky part is that once the label is on, the harm is almost impossible to prove.
Yeah. You can never know the counterfactual. Once a person is diagnosed, or self-diagnoses, there's no way to know for sure what would have happened if they hadn't gotten that label. Did the symptoms really emerge on their own, or were they subtly created or amplified by the person trying to align with the criteria they learned online? That uncertainty is exactly why clinicians have to be so careful and rigorous with the powerful labels they assign.
Which brings us back to the essential and maybe uncomfortable truth here. A diagnosis can explain your wiring, but it doesn't excuse your behavior. That intersection of clinical understanding and personal accountability seems like the only way forward.
Understanding your cognitive deficits is step one. It's crucial. But step two is taking radical responsibility for the impact you have on other people. A diagnosis might explain why you struggle with time, but it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card for constantly disrespecting your colleagues or your partner by being late or not following through. You have to manage the consequences of your wiring. You can't just expect the world to be your emotional support staff.
And this tension between the label and your own sense of agency, the pressure to conform to a stereotype, was shown really powerfully in that study of the reality show Survivor, David versus Goliath.
That study was fascinating. It was a perfect real-world example of labeling theory in action. The contestants were just arbitrarily put into one of two tribes: the Davids, who were framed as underdogs fighting adversity, and the Goliaths, who were framed as winners with all the advantages.
Right.
And researchers found that the contestants strongly identified with the characteristics of their assigned label and started acting in line with those cultural stereotypes.
And the most interesting finding was how the negative label was internalized.
Yes. Even though both tribes won almost the same number of individual challenges, the people who got the negatively stereotyped label, the Davids, were more defined by it internally. They had a higher alignment score with their label than the Goliaths did, even while they were constantly talking about being individuals and pushing back against the underdog stereotype.
So the Goliaths, who had the good label, just sort of accepted it and used it for team unity.
Exactly. They called themselves Goliath Strong. But the Davids, they were fighting the label on the outside, but on the inside, they were more profoundly affected by its assumptions.
And that's the direct danger for people who are incorrectly labeling themselves as disordered. They might fight the external stigma, but internally, they could be accepting and operating on the label's negative assumptions.
It can easily lead to that self-fulfilling prophecy, where you unconsciously start seeing yourself through a lens of greater deficit than is actually there. And that holds you back from growth and from true accountability.
The accountability deficit is huge, but we also have to talk about the systemic issues that let this whole misinformation ecosystem thrive in the first place. That brings us to the legal and ethical gaps, like the lawsuits trying to hold social media platforms accountable for youth mental health.
The Seattle Public Schools lawsuit, and the many others that have joined it, is a huge attempt to hold these big social media companies responsible for the population-level harm being done to students. The biggest legal problem they face is proving population-level causality.
Right.
It's just incredibly hard to isolate the exposure and the harm when basically every single young person is online.
It's like trying to study the effects of smoking if everyone on Earth smoked.
That's the perfect analogy. And it's made harder by decades of legal precedent, specifically Section 230, which shields platforms from liability for what their users post. So the lawsuits have had to shift their argument. It's not just about the user content anymore.
It's about the platform's design.
It's about the design. They're arguing that the algorithms and the features are intentionally addictive, they promote harmful comparison, and they spread unhealthy content. That makes them inherently defective products.
So the focus has to be on regulating the platform's choices, not the users.
Precisely. The solutions need to focus on holding platforms responsible for creating algorithms that are known to be addictive or harmful, rather than punishing kids for using them. The idea is to mandate healthier digital spaces, and of course to do more community-based, youth-driven research to help users have a better relationship with technology, because we also have to acknowledge that social media can provide positive community and connection.
So to try and turn this really complex problem into some kind of path forward, the research points to a roadmap, a few systemic steps to mitigate the impact of all this misinformation.
Right. The first step is all about the access problem that drives people online to begin with. States need to adopt legislation like PSY-PAT-CT, which is an interstate agreement that lets licensed professionals practice across state lines.
So that immediately helps with the resource shortage.
It immediately helps. And at the same time, we need to pursue legal charges against what are called ghost networks.
What are those?
Ghost networks are essentially fraudulent or unlicensed online mental health practices. They make deceptive claims about their credentials and services. Aggressively going after them is essential to cleaning up the digital space.
Okay, and the second step is about the legitimate providers themselves.
Yes. Mental health professionals can't just wait for patients to find them. They need to proactively make themselves more accessible to communities that are usually ignored or underdiagnosed. Rural communities, underserved populations, people who need culturally competent care. That shrinks the gap that the internet is currently trying to fill.
The third step goes after the financial motive we talked about earlier, accountability for selling symptoms.
Exactly. The FTC and state consumer protection agencies have to get much more aggressive about investigating and pursuing cases against creators who don't transparently disclose that they're using mental health info primarily to sell a product or a service. Transparency is the key regulatory tool here. It helps dismantle the profit incentive behind misleading content.
And finally, a more creative legal solution aimed at the creators of the misinformation, not just the platforms.
This step suggests that private litigants should consider bringing tort claims, so civil claims for a wrongful act, against content creators who have negligently spread misinformation that directly harms someone. If a creator, for example, tells their followers to stop taking medication or to try some dangerous self-treatment and someone gets hurt, a tort claim could hold that creator personally liable. At the end of the day, this whole deep dive really just shows the absolute necessity of critical thinking in our digital world. Self-advocacy and knowledge, they are powerful tools for healing and for finding a community. But we have to stay aware of the social packaging that these labels create. We have to guard against just reflexively adopting unnecessary labels that come with all this negative cultural baggage. Whether those labels come from a bad self-diagnosis or an overly broad clinical definition, they fundamentally and often negatively shape how we see ourselves and how we act.
And that takes us right back to that dinner table, when the charisma just evaporates the moment accountability shows up, and a label is used as a weapon to force compliance and to escape consequences. What we're seeing is a profound cultural failure of emotional adulthood. Nothing, not a label, not a symptom, not a clinical diagnosis, and definitely not a 5-second TikTok slideshow, is a substitute for the core, unglamorous work of taking responsibility for your choices and for the impact those choices have on other people. It's the essential price of being a functional adult in a shared world.